Hi, this is Rick with the Lost Samba podcast, Beleza? This week we're going to talk about an atomic bomb of creativity and of talent and of rebelliousness. The guy who presented the world, Paulo Coelho, the famous author, the rocker and fallen angel of Brazilian music, Raul Seixas.
Eu prefiro ser essa metamorfose ambulante do que ser aquela velha opinião formada sobre tudo.
Salvador, the capital of the state of Bahia, is known for its Afro-Brazilian vibe, its Afro-Brazilian culture, capoeira, the candomblé, olodum, and the state of Bahia is known for being the most typical Brazilian one. You know, that was where the samba comes from. Salvador is the oldest capital of Brazil, the first capital of Brazil. The state gave the world, or gave Brazil, Jorge Amado, its biggest author. It also gave talents, musical talents, such as Dorival Caymmi, Caetano Veloso, Gilberto Gil, João Gilberto. Imagine being born in this context and being stung by the virus of rock and roll as a teenage pubescent. This was the case of Raul Seixas, exposed to films of Elvis Presley, images of Chuck Berry, of Little Richard, with access to a lot of American records because he was neighbors to people who worked for the American consulate, and he was just drawn into this world of rebelliousness and of rock and roll. May it be clear, while other musicians of his generation saw themselves as proper musicians, they all studied music, they delved into the classics, or they delved into Brazilian culture deeply, they listened to jazz, they read. What drove Raul Seixas to music was the rebelliousness of rock and roll. His dad was an engineer who, with the likeness for books, he had a huge library at home, and Raul, who would later say that his name was a mixture of a shout ha and of a howl ooh, so Raul. He was a bookworm. He read a lot, but he hated school. He was a proper rebel. He never went. He repeated his first year like 5 times. He would falsify his reports to show his parents, to keep them calm. But he was a terrible student, a truant. He lived in the streets. And in this situation or in this mindset, he formed with some other guys with similar interests the first rock and roll gang in Salvador, probably in Brazil. And they would walk around with their collars up and looking like rock and rollers. They'd commit petty crimes, probably bully people, pick up fights. And no one understood what they were about. They were like aliens, but they were living the rock and roll rebelliousness in Salvador. The next step was to form a band, which he did. The band was called The Panthers in English. Later on, he translated it into Os Panteras. And they played the instruments very, very, very bad. It was all about rock and roll. It was probably close to what the punks did in the 1980s. And lo and behold, they were a big success. They didn't even sing in English. They babbled their lyrics were babbling that sounded like English. But they gigged all over the place in Salvador, and they actually had quite a big following. They filled up theaters, and people would go to listen to rock and roll. They were like the preachers of rock and roll in Salvador. In this context, they met Jerry Adriani, the starlet of the Jovem Guarda. The Jovem Guarda was a Brazilian movement who brought rock and roll to Brazil, right? But this was the record companies wanting to sell or to repeat the success that Elvis Presley and later on the Beatles did in Cliff Richards did in the UK, and they had the star system, right? So they were interested in having pretty faces and guys who made the audiences go crazy and basically sell records. Raul Seixas, because of this contact with Adriani, thought that he could make it, and he went to Rio with his band at first, and then the rest of the band went back. He stayed there alone, but nothing happened. Nothing happened. He was refused everywhere because they weren't interested in proper rock and roll, which is what Raul Seixas, or Raulzito at the time, was interested in. He went as low as being physically hungry. He went back to Salvador, but when he got back to Salvador, he got a call from Jerry Adriani saying that his recording company was interested in having him as a producer. Jerry Adriani probably convinced them of such. Os Panteras had recorded a little album, they were recording, so he convinced them, and they invited Raul Seixas to be a producer, because obviously they needed someone who understood rock and roll to make their singers sound rockish. So Raul accepted. He went to Rio. Money started coming in. He was a successful producer. He started writing songs also, but romantic songs for these starlets, and he went as far to begin a family in Rio. But of course, once the rock and roll virus is in you, it doesn't leave easily. So the stability got to him. He started getting bored with this life, and he started wanting to produce his own stuff. At one point, the Jovem Guarda produced great talents. It was close to the commercial rock of the beginning of the 60s and the 50s in the United States and in the UK and elsewhere in the world, like with local rock and roll starlets, disposable artists. But as they went out of fashion, they created a genre called brega, right? Brega is not only a genre, it's an aesthetic. So this aesthetic, I think anyone in the world knows what I'll talk about. It's like cheesy music, or a cheesy way of being, with stars like Julio Iglesias, Johnny Hallyday in France, Cliff Richards in the UK, Mariah Carey nowadays. They sell a lot, but they're not cool. So this is the brega thing. And if you analyze Raul Seixas' work honestly and profoundly, it is brega on acid. While he had his job, his daytime job, Raul started producing his own personal work at home. This work obviously reflected his beliefs, or from what he had experienced as a rebellious youth, or by what he had read in his dad's library. It had a strong anarchic undertone, serious anarchism, not superficial one. It also was very critical of the bourgeoisie. Those days, Brazil was living what you call the economic miracle, so people in all classes were earning well, right? Although it was a dictatorship, the money was flowing. Brazil was growing at rates of 10%, 12% a year, so it was like a booming country. And his criticisms were oriented at this affluent middle class who had nothing in their mind and who led a life like cattle. His first work, right, was opera rock, right, that used tango, that used rock, that used music from the Northeast and has cheesy moments and rock and roll moments. And it's about these middle class problematic people. And apart from him, the main other actors were a gay guy and a lesbian. Now, this, in that context of Puritan middle class in a dictatorship, was completely off the rail and unacceptable. Obviously, his play or his opera rock only played like for 2 sessions or for 3 sessions, and it was censored. They closed. It was forbidden by the police. They couldn't do it. This bug of rock and roll continued bugging him, and it got worse and worse and worse. And people close to him said, look, if you're not happy, you should put your songs in the festivals. The festivals were the avenue in which artists got famous in those days. All the Tropicalia had gone through festivals. Many people of the Bossa Nova gone through festivals. Jorge Ben, everyone you can imagine had gone to festivals. So he decided to put his songs in the festivals. And his first song there was actually very successful. It was a mixture of Baião with rock and roll, with Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry-like rock and roll, which he discovered blended very well.
Let me sing, let me sing, let me sing my rock and roll. Let me sing, let me swing, let me sing my blues and go. Não vim aqui tratar dos seus problemas, o seu Messias ainda não chegou. Eu vim rever a moça de Ipanema e vim dizer que o sonho terminou.
So what he did was not patronizing as what people who had done the same, or people of the middle class or that went to festivals, when they recorded songs from the Northeast or with the Northeastern rhythms, they were all very patronizing, showing the Northeast as a good savage and saying they're oppressed people, we have to help them, where's our consciousness? No. Raul Seixas, he put that because it blended well, and he put his rock and roll rebelliousness using the rhythm. So it wasn't patronizing at all. The two genres are very testosterone infused. They're two macho songs, rock and roll and Baião. And he did a song putting his trademark acidity. When I say acidity, is his acid criticisms to the middle class. He became accepted by the recording companies. He left as a producer and he started recording. Now, he knew what he wanted to do. He knew what his message was. It was working. But he also knew that he wasn't the best lyrics writer. You know, doing the music, it's like normally 3 chords. It was very simple, but he needed good songwriters. So he had a lot of partnerships, but one day he read this article in a magazine, an esoteric magazine. You had many of them circulating not only in Brazil, throughout the world. He read this article about extraterrestrials and flying saucers that really caught his attention, and he decided to get in contact with the author of that article. The author of that article now is a world bestseller, read by presidents, by big intellectuals, by everyone, Paulo Coelho. It was an intense bromance, a very productive bromance, and in the words of Paulo Coelho, it was almost like a marriage. The two were inseparable. I believe that for a while they lived together, and they produced a lot of great songs, iconic songs, which the more you hear, the more you say, wait, this is telling me something. This is really good. In their first song, called Hey Al Capone, telling people to beware or not to be too crazy. So it says, hey, Al Capone, pay attention because the tax man is after you. They also tell Jimi Hendrix to stop with the drugs, but the sentence that really stands out is that they say, hey, Jesus Christ, abandon the Father and go and die in peace. Now, this is pretty revolutionary in a right-wing dictatorship. And it passed the censorship. You could probably say that he was too clever for the censorship. It was more oriented towards students, towards clever people. The censors took him as just this crazy dude doing, pretending to be a hippie, and they didn't take him seriously. One of the best songs is one called Gita. That's the word Gita comes from the Bhagavad Gita or the Bhagavad Gita. I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. And it's like a discourse of how life or how consciousness circulates within people's lives. It's a very, very clever song, and it has obviously the presence of Paulo Coelho's geniality. And there are many other great songs that came out at the same level at the time. Was a very productive time. What one has to bear in mind that these were days that the Beatles had just finished, so their legacy was still very present. Jimi Hendrix's too. There were all these great bands like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, yes, doing their best albums. So the musical industry was booming with this kind of lysergic rock and roll. And in a time where there was no social media, this was very important. Everybody listened to it, everybody talked about it, and everybody lived the experience. So this was a bubble, a very creative and interesting bubble, and it served Paulo Coelho and Raul Seixas marvelously. They were the Brazilian embassy of this countercultural explosion that was happening at the time. It's very difficult to explain for people who didn't live it how it was, but it was present everywhere. Guys with long hair, you met people and you immediately found common ground. It were very interesting days. Him and Paulo Coelho came up with the idea of the alternative society. So every show there was a song, Hail the Alternative Society, where everybody was equal and everybody was free to do whatever they wanted. It said, do what you do because that is the actual law, the actual natural law. Everybody had to do what they had to do. And if everybody did that, it would be okay. The military wouldn't have an army to go to. They wouldn't have an enemy to fight against. It was very radical. Paulo Coelho not only introduced or took his music to a different level, he also introduced them to all sorts of drugs you can imagine, from acid to cocaine, mushrooms, everything. I would say both of them took everything you can imagine. But he also introduced Raul Seixas to a demonic side. He was a Satanist, Paulo Coelho, at the time, and he took Raul Seixas to the sessions. He went to serious sessions, and Raul Seixas also became a Satanist, and he has a lot of references of this in his music. Paulo Coelho was a follower or a reader of the Englishman Aleister Crowley, who's considered like the father of demonic studies, who was read by the guys in Led Zeppelin, by the Beatles, by the Rolling Stones. The dictatorship had been successful in suppressing the left, like all leftist students or militants, they were or exiled, or they were killed, or they were in jail. So they suppressed this. So the dictatorship, a new general came in, who kind of, General Geisel, he appointed to that the dictatorship was going to end. He was like of the softer side of the military. Well, I'm saying softer, I could have also said the more intelligent side of the military. And there were signs that it was going to end. So the repression forces, they had to justify their job. So their thing now was to repress any encounter of young people. I remember my sister, she's 6 years older than me. She said that in her university, if they saw 5 students together, they'd go there and say, hey, you can't be like this, circulate. So obviously there were festivals, there were gigs, and the police was always very present. They said it was against drugs, but it was against the whole culture. Hitali was put in the jail at the time on this basis. It was to show that, hey, we can imprison your leaders, so beware, be careful. So there's talk that Raul Seixas was in danger of being put in jail, so he exiled himself in the United States, which also changed his work. Started to sound a lot like Bob Dylan. Throughout Raul Seixas' work, there's a lot of copying and pasting of American stuff, but Bob Dylan's voice and his kind of work, both authors, they have like very long lyrics. They have a lot in common. Raul Seixas, in this context, he became a spokesman for a big chunk of the youth, which wasn't as sophisticated as the left-wing university students of the 60s. But also they had their own problems at home, very oppressive families, very unfair job market. So he became the spokesman, and he talked to these people directly because the music was very easy to listen to, the lyrics were excellent and profound, and they attracted these people to his work. Crazily enough, it became, after a few years, like a cult. The Raul Seixas following took every word that he said like textually. It's like almost like a Bible kind of thing. This exists until nowadays. Famously, Jimmy Page, the guitarist of Led Zeppelin, for a few years he used to go often to spend his holidays in Brazil because of a Brazilian girlfriend, and he went to hippie places. And many times he was playing there, and they'll ask him, hey, stop playing this nonsense, play some Raul Seixas, because this is what we hear here. So that's shows how his following was. Paulo Coelho and Raul Seixas, they eventually broke up. As Paulo Coelho says, it was like a marriage, but it had no sex, so no stimulus for the two to stay together forever. They started fighting, bickering, as happens in most friendships and in most relationships, and they went separate ways. Raul Seixas continued with other partners, co-writers, but some people will say it's the legacy of Paulo Coelho. He went strong into drinking. He unfortunately became a proper alcoholic, a serious alcoholic, and he eventually died because of this. He was a very skinny and weak guy, and his body couldn't stand so much substance abuse. He was not only alcohol, it was also ether. He used to smell ether. He wasn't into weed, but cocaine and stuff like that. So he ended up it ended up affecting his body, and he died prematurely. At the end of his career, when no because it got too difficult to handle by producers, by recording companies, and the industry, who had moved on. Now the thing was like new age. There was punk, but punk was like subterranean, so to speak, niche market. But it had moved on in the 80s to cleaner rock and more produced bands, better musically. And they refused to record Raul Seixas. He was from a different era, and he also, because he was alcoholic, he didn't show up in gigs. He showed up drunk to record. So he was banned, but he had a comeback very late in his life, with a punk rocker equally from Salvador, Marcelo Nova, and they did many gigs together. They did 50 gigs together, to be textually, and he was already suffering. His health was suffering, and finally he passed in 1989, which coincidentally is the year that I left Brazil. What you can say about Raul Seixas is that he was about liberty, right? Freedom for you to be yourself, which is what rock and roll is all about. And he took that to the extreme, but as in the case of so many other artists in rock and roll, he took it the freedom was to take drugs, industrialized drugs, that ended up destroying him. The song I'm going to sing today, it's a very short one, but it's very iconic of who he was and where he came from. It's called the Flea in the Soup. So it says, I'm the flea in your soup who's there to give you a hard time. So it's people's consciousness reacting to this bourgeois world, you know, where you're forced to work and we're almost slaves without even feeling it. And it mixes the music of candomblé with rock and roll, also a perfect fusion, again without being patronizing to the Afro music. It just uses it. And it says that if you exterminate me, another fly will come in my place. So that's mosca na sopa for you. Eu sou a mosca que pousou na sua sopa. Eu sou a mosca que pintou pra lhe abusar. Eu sou a mosca que pousou na sua sopa. Eu sou a mosca que pintou pra lhe abusar. Eu sou a mosca que perturba o seu sono. Eu sou a mosca do teu quarto a zumbizar. Eu sou a mosca que perturba o teu sono. Eu sou a mosca no teu quarto a zumbizar. E não adianta vir me dedetizar, pois nem o DDT pode assim me exterminar, porque você me mata e vem outro em meu lugar. Eu sou a mosca que pousou na sua sopa. Eu sou a mosca que pintou pra dormizar. Eu sou a mosca que pousou na sua sopa. Eu sou a mosca que pintou pra lhe abusar. Eu sou a mosca que perturba o teu sono. Eu sou a mosca no teu quarto a zumbizar. E não adianta vir me dedetizar, pois nem o DDT pode assim me exterminar, porque você me mata e vem outro em meu lugar. As a traditional quirk the podcast of Raul Seixas, I'm going to give my own experience in a gig that I went over his. It's in my book, Los Samba. And this was a night where he obviously appeared like 2 hours late, or perhaps I'm exaggerating, but he appeared very late, and like people were already thinking of leaving, and the owner of the venue, a very beautiful venue, it's Parque Lagem, it's like an old house that was donated to the city of Rio. It has a huge kind of internal patio with a pool, and it has appeared in films, and nowadays there's an extraordinary cafe there, very beautiful. It appeared in one of the best films of the cinema novo, Terra em Transe. I thoroughly recommend it. And there were many gigs there at the time. It ended up being closed because the neighbors, it's in the middle of a park, it's in the middle of a forest, but the neighbors could hear the gigs and they ended up complaining, and the place had to close. And then it became an art center. Anyway, so there was this huge gig of Raul Seixas. You know, he was already pretty advanced in his age or decay, although he was in his 40s. I don't think he reached his 50s, but he was already forgetting the lyrics, and he he forgot it, and then he and he continued, but the band would kind of play over him to make him sound less worse. And but still it was crowded, and as I said before, his following was like a cult. So there were all these Raul Seixas fans, all dressed in black, like a bit like the heavy metal crowd. Most of them migrated to heavy metal, and this had nothing to do with what we other non-Raul Seixas fans were living. This was the 80s, so people went a lot to the beach, and they had all this gel on their hair, and they seem like dinosaurs from the past. Anyway, so he did his gig, and the last song was the song about the alternative society, the Sociedade Alternativa, which he wrote with Paulo Coelho. And at the end of the show, as was the tradition, he declared the laws or the statutes of how the alternative society would be. And the last sentence is, in the alternative society, people will be allowed to kill those who don't agree with them or those who bother them. And having said this, he just left the stage, the band continued, and stopped playing. And that was the end of the show. Everybody was a bit stunned. The people who weren't traditional Raul Seixas fans, who had heard him say this millions of times, everybody was a bit shocked. And this guy goes and gets the microphone and says, "Comrades, I disagree with what Raul Seixas has just said. This is an absurd. Are we going back to our animal instincts? We shouldn't do this." And like people started booing the guy out. "Go out!" You know, I won't repeat the things that they said, but they offended him with swear words and everything. "Get out of there, you blah blah blah." And someone threw a can at him, a Coca-Cola can or a beer can at him. 2 or 3 came, and he was like, dodged them, and he said, yeah, show that you're animals, throw more, you know, show how ignorant you are. You're as ignorant as Raul. And that was, I looked up, because there were like 2 floors. There was like a rain, I've never seen that, a rain of beer cans. It was like a non-stop flow of beer cans on top of the guy. The guy obviously ran away. He got down from the stage and sheltered, and the crowd was there like, how, So like it was really like being in a cult. So that was very funny. I hope you liked the podcast, and I hope to see you next week. Até mais.